ultimately to have, let's call it like terminal value product market fit, like the ability to actually kind of win an entire category. That requires just getting into these product foot races for a very long period of time and then winning them. And if you don't have that DNA and you don't really invest in and cultivate it, then you're not going to win that foot race, and somebody else is going to be able to marshal all of their go-to-market resources against you in the long run.
Welcome to In Depth, a show that surfaces tactical advice founders and startup leaders need to grow their teams, companies, and themselves. I'm Brett Burson, a partner at First Round, and we're a venture capital firm that helps startups like Notion, Roblox, Uber, and Square tackle company building firsts. On the In-Depth podcast, we share weekly conversations with startup leaders that skip the talking points and go deeper into not just what to do, but how to do it. Learn more and subscribe today at firstround.com. Today on In-Depth, I got the chance to sit down with Bill Magnuson and Kevin Wang from Braze. Braze is a customer relationship platform for managing your multi-channel marketing and has a $4.4 billion market cap. Bill originally joined back in 2011 when the company was still called AppBoy as the co-founder and CTO, and now he's CEO. Kevin was AppBoy's 8th employee and has since become the chief product officer. In today's conversation, we start from the very beginning, when Bill had a chance meeting with AppBoy's founder, Mark Gurmanson, on a New York street corner during TechCrunch Disrupt. From there, we trace the company's path to product market fit. If you page the calendar back to 2011, the mobile app ecosystem was vastly different and more tenuous. App development was mostly for hobbyists, and AppBoy's pitch to turn your app into a business had a ton of skeptics. I unpack with Bill and Kevin why they had such firm conviction that the mobile app economy was much, much bigger than skeptics believed. Kevin also explained that they ignored the lean startup advice to start with a narrow product and instead immediately built a robust platform. They also tell the story about how they nabbed their first handful of customers, including their earliest enterprise logos, and how Braze has tackled the competitive landscape as it's become much more crowded. And now, onto my conversation with Bill and Kevin, tracing Braze's path from zero to IPO. All right. Thank you guys both for joining.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Bill, maybe we could sort of have you kick it off. And the place I was curious to start is, what were you doing in the 12 months before you ended up working to get Braze off the ground?
Yeah, so I'll actually go back a couple years because I graduated from MIT, studied computer science there, and finished my undergrad in 2009. So that was well timed with kind of the early launch of the smartphone industry, early launch of the app stores. And then I moved out to San Francisco and worked at Google in Mountain View for a time. Ended up writing my master's thesis there, but I was working on a visual programming language for building Android applications right at the launch. I remember Cupcake launched that summer, rolled the big fiberglass cupcake out on the lawn of the Android building. Definitely a really exciting time to be at the ground floor of mobile. And the visual programming language we were working on was actually targeted toward education and trying to kind of bring app development to people that were still introductory computer science students. We were working with a number of colleges in their freshman courses to teach computer science, but do so in a way where someone could make something tangibly useful to themselves on a mobile device and do so in a way without a ton of software sophistication. And it was really cool to see that come to life because, the idea that you would be able to do that even in a desktop application would require big teams and huge amounts of time. But because mobile was so new, and because these devices could interact with the physical world and they would be your companion, even simple ideas could come to life quickly. And so, I was there for the ground floor and you could see all this energy and this excitement in mobile, but this was still very much early days. People were still really nervous about putting a credit card into a mobile app. This concept of digital purchases was brand new. Paradoxically, even the purchasing of mobile apps in the App Store, I think in the early days was holding back people thinking about building them as businesses because you didn't have any recurring revenue or ongoing revenue streams from your mobile app users. It was like all the money you were ever going to make from them was right up front. And, but I could see that the energy was there and really wanted to make sure that as the world was going to change as we adopted mobile, that I was going to be a part of it.
What did you identify as back then? Were you just sort of like a product builder and hacker? Were you interested in businesses? What were you kind of like before you started the company?
There's a brief foray in between that where I went back. So I went back to school, got my master's, kept working at Google while I was getting my master's, and actually wrote my thesis on that visual programming language. But then I had a brief stint in the finance industry, went and worked at Bridgewater Associates, which is a global macro hedge fund up in Connecticut. And, I always had a strong interest in macroeconomics and in business and largely in systems. And, wanted to kind of make the leap to be an entrepreneur, start a company for a variety of reasons as I graduated from my master's in 2010, related to kind of family and finances that I won't get into right now. I made the personal choice to just go and work in the hedge fund industry for a little bit of time. But, through that time, the family situation stabilized. I accomplished the kind of financial goals that I had. And 16 months later, was ready to take the plunge and go start a company. And so I left there, but considered myself a software engineer for sure. I started out as the CTO at Braze, had studied computer science in school, still consider myself certainly a software engineer and a technologist, but was also always very interested in the economic side of it. And a big part of what made mobile really interesting to me was just how it was impacting our systems and our way of living, our relationships with institutions and with each other, and really giving us that access to knowledge and communication that we were going to be able to bring with us everywhere we went. And, it's easy to look back at that now and see why it fundamentally changed the way that we lived our lives. But I still remembered having debates, even back at MIT, with people that was like, why am I ever going to need a smartphone? Speak like, well, life's not about need. The fact that this brings you freedom and it brings you communication and access to knowledge wherever you are in any moment of the day, I felt was fundamentally important. And it was just something that I wanted to be a part of in order to help people build businesses and what I thought was going to be a fundamental change in the economy and the way that we lived our lives.
Did you find that Bridgewater was useful, that experience was useful in the context of eventually being a founder, or was it just sort of a digression on the path and there's not a lot of residual value?
No, I absolutely do think it was incredibly useful. One of the major values at Bridgewater is focused around transparency. And one of the things that means is that if your ears are open, you can really learn a lot about a lot of different parts of the business. And, Bridgewater's transparency is even at the level that the equivalent of their board meetings would be recorded and sent out, not just for viewing, but sometimes even for lesson work, where you would listen to recordings happening in the management committee meetings and hear about how the company strategy was being formulated. You could very visibly see where things were breaking due to scale. I was there as an intern actually in 2008, and I came back a couple years later, and they had tripled in size during that time period. And there's a lot of things that break as you scale and triple, in a short period of time. And because of the transparency and the introspection of the Bridgewater culture, anyone that wanted to could have a front row seat for really seeing where those systems were breaking down. And it wasn't just in the investment process and the investment strategy, it was in all the different operations of the business, the finance organization, the talent team, the client services department, and really looking at how the organization developed and scaled in a way that was hypercritical, very analytical, and very transparent. I didn't really realize how valuable that was until later on when we ran into some of the same scaling challenges and I wasn't approaching them for the first time and I wasn't approaching them in a vacuum. And I also already had the experience of seeing it at a company that actually is pretty similar in scale to where Braze is today. We're about 1,700 employees now. And when I was at Bridgewater, we were about 1,500. And that actually carried over into aspects of the Braze culture as well, where, we make sure that we're providing push-based transparency out there. There's a lot that's available to any employee in any part of the company in any part of the world to be able to understand what the strategy is down to a detailed level, how we define success, how we measure success, how we're doing against those targets that we have. And, not everyone opts in to actually ingesting all of that transparency. It's obviously, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of reading, it's a lot of time. But one of the things that I learned at Bridgewater was both the value that has for people that really want to lean into it in terms of growing, their part of the business and taking more comprehensive ownership, but also the value of having those values in your company culture and in the way that you operate.
I'd also say, as somebody who was in the early days of Braze, but did not work at Bridgewater, our other co-founder and now CTO, John Hyman, was at Bridgewater with Bill. One aspect of Bridgewater's culture that I really appreciated and continue to appreciate is that there's a very strong emphasis on first principles thinking. And I think that particularly when you have a journey in the startup days like Braze does, where you're entering a new, very rapidly evolving market and there isn't a lot of history that you can necessarily lean on, that sort of first principles approach and approach of thinking about how do we debate and discover the underlying ground truth of our market sort of from those first principles, I think that was actually really instrumental to the early success.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when things are changing so quickly, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of opinions about where you should prioritize and, place your chips. And to be able to have a well-regarded, well-reasoned, well-debated opinion about where the puck is moving to so that you can anticipate that. And we talk a lot about being on the right side of history, as we were going through early product development. And I think that especially when you're a small company in a highly competitive space and you in some cases have incumbent or enterprise competitors, you need to just make those calls correctly more often than not, because you just don't have the resources or the time to be making mistakes about where the future is going and how things are going to evolve. And I think that when you approach a lot of these problems from that more first principles thinking, you get more robust models about how the world works, how, this lever is connected to that one, how these things are going to respond over here. And that helps you make better investments.
Given first principles thinking is sort of one of those phrases that's sort of thrown around a lot, but not particularly well defined, how did it instantiate itself in those first few years? What's a story of early building that shows kind of what that actually looks like?
I'll actually use an example from data privacy, which is a landscape that has really evolved a lot over time. And in the early days of mobile, there were a lot of abuses of data privacy because the operating systems didn't really have protection around them. There was a lot of use of hardware identifiers and location data and such that are foreign to today's digital landscape, even as, a lot of the, for instance, the ad tech or the analytics world has advanced quite a bit. And location data, I think, is a good case study in this, because if you just think about yourself as a human, and you think about some of the data that's most valuable to you, location is close to the top of that list, like where you are in the physical world. So we actually, in the early days, we had basic geofencing capability, but there were a lot of companies that were building a lot of kind of insights that are derived from location data. They were building taste graphs and other sorts of trait information that you could kind of harvest and pull in and be able to use that to help target marketing messaging that was, based off of location data that was coming from ad networks and other places. We just felt that because we as humans treat that with such sensitivity, that it would be a game of cat and mouse forever and was not one that was worth playing. We were very focused on the first party ecosystem. We wanted to, I've always used this phrase of being a good listener rather than a creepy detective, and really making sure that to the extent that you're using data in order to personalize or enhance the relevance in marketing messaging or in, other ways that you might be modifying the product experience, that those should all be done in a way that's respectful and that has reciprocation, where when someone's providing you the data, you're doing something good with it in order to enhance their experience. You're not just like bundling it up and selling it to the highest bidder, which is what a lot of competing services were doing at the time and what a lot of, early mobile apps were doing as well. And a lot of our competitors also were able to provide differentiated, targeting and personalization capabilities, because in many places, at least we felt that they were abusing privacy in a lot of ways. And it was our perspective that along the way, whether it was governments or it was the operating systems, or it was consumer sentiment. And then eventually, you see the chain of events where it's like there's investigative journalism around these topics, and then outrage follows, and then, Congress takes action or the platforms change. And along the way, there were a lot of things that were existential threats to people's feature sets or to their business models, or they were like really disruptive changes where they had to change the way that they were working. But because we stayed rooted in what we felt was a kind of first principles understanding of the sensitivity of certain data and of value exchange when it comes to kind of trading your privacy for relevance and personalization, I feel confident saying I don't think we've ever had to roll back a feature we've built over time because of new data privacy legislation or new changes in the operating systems. And so that's just a great example of being on the right side of history, making sure that you're actually being very efficient with your resources. You're not building things where the whole world's gonna get turned upside down on you a year from now. And, we were able, while everybody else was like scrambling for GDPR, or they were dealing with the IDFA changes in iOS or all these other things, we just kept building and we kept executing. And none of those things were issues because we predicted that, changes of that ilk would eventually happen. And we stayed on the right side of history.
Bill, I wanted to go back to the journey we were talking about. What was the transition from Bridgewater to actually founding the company?
There's kind of the mindset around it. There's the literal actions that happened. And I think that, I had grown up in rural Minnesota during the dot-com boom. And my computer was my gateway out of rural Minnesota to the rest of the world, and was really attached to that and kind of enamored by how comprehensively and how quickly the world changed through, the late 90s and into the early 2000s. But, I was also a kid in my parents' basement, luckily had a computer and internet connection, but didn't really have a lot of opportunity to interact with it more meaningfully. And then, as I entered the job market and graduated from school, here came mobile. And it felt to me like mobile was going to be as much or more important, on a similar timeline as, the dot-com boom was in, the mid and late 90s. And I just knew that I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if I was at a hedge fund on the sidelines for it as the whole world was changing. Because, going back to your first question, absolutely still, consider myself a technologist. It's what really, the being able to build and create, new things with new discoveries and new innovations is really what makes me tick as a person. And, the things that I mentioned before that were kind of in my life that I needed to stabilize, that was mission accomplished. And so, I'd already had a bit of a wandering mind, if you will, and I was ready to make the jump. And then I actually took part in the TechCrunch Disrupt New York Hackathon with John Hyman, who, as Kevin mentioned before, was my boss when I first started at Bridgewater and was my fellow technical co-founder when we started Braze, then called Appboy, all the way back in 2011. We ended up getting top honors in the hackathon, and that resulted in a chance encounter a few days later where we were on our way to the conference to present our winning hackathon project. And I met Bipul Sinha, who coincidentally I actually just had a call with earlier today and got some advice from him on a role that I'm working on right now. It was really awesome to see him because I ran into him on a crosswalk corner on the west side of Manhattan in, I guess it would have been May or June of 2011. And he's the one who then saw us on stage and tracked me down afterward and introduced John and I to our third co-founder, who happened to be living down in Texas at the time and, wanted to do something in mobile. He knew Bipul. Bipul was a partner at Lightspeed at the time. He later would go on to be the CEO of Rubrik, who actually IPO'd midway through last year. And that kind of chance encounter brought the three of us together to be able to decide to start a company. And then me, John, and, Mark, we all got together at a restaurant in New York and we just discussed our ambitions and our excitement for, the mobile ecosystem. And Mark he actually, crazily enough, was the CEO of an oil and natural gas company in this moment when we're having this dinner. But he had been working on some entrepreneurial pursuits on the side as well, some of them around mobile. He had worked on building this social network for app developers. I think it would have been about a year prior to this. So in like 2010, under the name Appboy. Before that ended up not going, gaining traction the way that he wanted it to, and kind of having a website for app developers to interact with their users was, switching, form mediums, if you will. And so he decided that he wanted to reboot it. And, John and I kind of came together as technical talent. And the fundamental goal in his original social network that also then carried through, and then what we built the idea of Appboy around, more specifically, was just that as a mobile app developer, you wanted to, in order to kind of run a more sustainable long-term business with your mobile app, you should know your customers really well and be able to communicate with them in order to drive, longer term engagement. And the idea for the company was just born from that, which I think is just a fundamental business insight, which is if you want to build, a sustainable business, you do that on the back of high quality long-term relationships. And if you want to build a relationship with someone, you should pay attention to people when you meet them, use that understanding to learn more about them, and then have more relevant interactions with them. And that'll build a strong relationship over time. And so we were just trying to take those very kind of human and basic business concepts and translate them into software that would help mobile app owners be able to, and they were primarily software developers at the time, actually. Mobile apps didn't even have marketing teams, and we can talk a little bit about the implications of that later. But, we really built to try to help encourage people that were building apps, turn those into sustainable businesses. And we were all just really excited about the opportunity that represented.
What was the thing that you built at the hackathon?
It was totally unrelated. And it was actually, if you remember Gilt, which was the flash auction site where they would do at a certain time each day, a whole bunch of products would become available at really attractive prices. And they had this cool game mechanic in their cart. There was limited inventory when they would do the flash sale. And you would buy it and it actually wouldn't check out right away. You'd have a certain amount of time while it sat in your cart and there'd be a countdown timer. And if you went to that product page while everything was sold out, it would say that something was in members' carts. And sometimes it would show back up in the inventory. So we actually built a plugin that let you register items in your cart as an auction. And then people that were on the page showing that it was sold out could bid on the items in the auction. And effectively, then when you would check out, it would just ship it directly to the person that won the auction instead of, you buying it yourself. And so it was an arbitrage opportunity on top of a place where you were allowed to hold inventory for free. And you could imagine that wrecking havoc on a restaurant reservation site or really anywhere you're allowed to hold inventory for free. And funnily enough, in the example, you can probably go dig up the video on YouTube somewhere. But when we did the live demo, it's John buying a bikini for himself because we found out partway through the hackathon that the Gilt website actually was different, whether or not you had a male profile or a female profile. And we did our prototyping in John's wife's account. And then when we were going to do the demo, we decided to make our own account, but the plugin didn't work because the website had changed it enough by being a male user profile. So we had to switch back to the wife's user profile and just go with it for the demo.
That's awesome. You mentioned sort of the insight that you landed on around businesses sort of understanding their customers, at least sort of in this sort of early days of app ecosystem getting built. When you had that meal, did you actually just talk about these ideas and land on that as the higher order bit in a meal? Or this is days or weeks of just open-ended discussion? Like, what got you to the higher order idea?
Yeah, crazily enough, we did land on that in the meal. And, I would spend years afterward on places like Hacker News reading these articles about, startup advice. And so many of them were, you got to treat your co-founder relationship like a marriage and you got to really vet it out. And it all just kind of clicked together and we just went with it. None of us were living in New York City proper at the time. Mark was in Houston and John and I were up in Connecticut because we both live near where Bridgewater is located. We decided kind of in a couple conversations afterward, but it was really just that one in-person meal that we were all going to quit our jobs and have a go of it. And we did spend weeks afterward together in New York on whiteboards, working out product spec and kind of going through all the capabilities that we wanted to be there and really work through the details of it. But that high level problem of, how do you help someone that's building a mobile app stay connected to their users better and be able to encourage ongoing usage? Like we knew that was what we were going to work on right out of the gate.
So then maybe you could talk a little bit more about those few weeks. So you had the lunch and you kind of explored a bunch of ideas and said, okay, that's interesting. You were then whiteboarding in those. Like, what did you actually do to go from the higher order insight to something you would actually ship to someone?
We worked out kind of the early object model and, what we wanted to be able to keep track of, how we wanted to communicate with people, and when the important moments were, in a mobile app user journey to be able to create that strong early connection and then ongoing engagement with people. And interestingly enough, the early version of AppBoy actually was a lot more opinionated and a lot more rigid. We built a number of game mechanics. We built out a user profile. I had cross-channel communication from the very beginning because when you try to solve a more fundamental problem like that, you realize that actually, unlike a lot of companies that are built to just be we're going to be a push notification service or we're going to do email marketing. Like they all start on a single channel. We were just trying to solve a business problem. And so we knew that we needed to be cross-channel from the very beginning. So we had 4 different message types. We had push notifications, email. We had a news feed. Before there was a Facebook news feed, I used to call it a mini blog inside your app, but its proper noun was the AppBoy news feed. And then we had our slide up message. We had a user profile. The early version of AppBoy actually let the user interact with the profile itself because it was meant to be like a profiling system that the user would be able to present themselves in like the app community as that person. Things like that ended up changing. That profile goes into the background. We ended up building more and more customizability for the onboarding, message flows and, various triggers that would happen throughout the life cycle and all those kinds of things along the way. But a lot of those early building blocks were all there because we were really working on that problem of what do we want to know about the person in order to drive more relevance and value? And then how are we going to communicate with them in an ongoing basis? And that really just drove a lot of that early product design.
It was also right at the transition point between the social wave into the mobile wave, which of course ended up being very tightly intertwined over time. But a lot of the things that you described about like the user profile moving to the background and it originally being this sort of editable concept was, I think, sort of an offshoot of the tail end of social being a huge part of how we were interacting. And as the market continued to evolve, it's like you have that North Star of what Bill and John and Mark were aiming at, but you end up evolving it for the way that the consumers and the way that the overall society as a whole is able to kind of interact with the technology. And I think that the way that they ended up sort of traversing that landscape was really instrumental to getting to product market fit, achieving traction, and ultimately making a lot of the product decisions that led to Braze growing the way that it has.
Kevin, maybe you could talk a little bit about what were you doing before you got involved with Braze, and like how did your app boy at the time, and what caused you to join? What was going on at the time?
I was working at Accenture doing consulting in the energy trading industry for a number of years prior to Braze. It was actually a fascinating industry. I am like as far as one can possibly be from it right now, but I sometimes still think about how it was really interesting. Like, you can go and trade like a strong wind over Texas. This is a financial instrument that exists out there. And from that experience, I got the chance to work very closely with a very, very old school legacy enterprise software that was being used in ways that were wildly productive for these energy companies. And that sort of planted the first seed in my head of, kids don't grow up thinking, man, I really want to do like enterprise SaaS one day. But from working with this technology, seeing how successful it was, I definitely got that idea that there was a huge amount of promise. And then that combined with observing from, a completely different place, a completely different state from where Bill and John were, the rise of mobile, I was very, very keen on figuring out a way to get to a place where I could both sort of pursue the fact that I saw a lot of opportunity in enterprise SaaS and also make sure that I was sort of catching these early side of the mobile wave that was blowing up. So Bill and I actually know one another from college. We were fraternity brothers at MIT. One time, Bill was passing through Boston where I was living with our now head of growth and our first employee, Spencer Burr. I think you guys were coming from a ski trip.
Yep. Yeah, we were up at Killington, swinging through Boston. I think we were doing something hiring related, like
I remember that
was going on, or there was interviewing to be
like
had.
Meeting a candidate or something like that. And stopped by, made the pitch, and it was pretty much exactly what I was looking to get involved with. Obviously, knew Bill, had a ton of respect for Bill, and also enterprise software in mobile, sort of really aimed at the way that the world was going rather than where it was right now. And yeah, that's how the journey began.
I gave it to him and I called him back and I was like, dude, when we were hanging out in Cambridge, all you did was complained about your job. And so I don't care if you take my job offer, but you need to quit your job and take someone else's job offer.
Yeah, I remember that. It's funny. I actually have the email where I turned it down, but I remember this phone call. And it was one of those phone calls where like, you hang up and you just kind of look at the phone for a while and just sort of think about your life and think about your future.
What was the state of the company when you joined, Kevin?
I was the 8th person into the room
and literally into the same small
into the same room. So we were in what was like the second or third WeWork created.
Yeah,
I think.
It was down in the meatpacking district. It was the early days of WeWork, and they actually ran out of money while they were building it.
As seen in the TV shows.
Yeah,
and
so we still had bare concrete floors, and the heat exchanger for the entire building was in our little glass box, and so it would get up to like 100 degrees in that room.
Yeah, one of the nice things about the concrete floor too is that we had a sort of an open music policy in the office. And I remember one time, sort of the third time that Rihanna song "We Found Love" came on in the day, very, very loud. Sitting there on the concrete floor, just like, wow, this is very, very different from big consulting, I would say. The people are way smarter, and this is a very much more scrappy environment. But overall, I think that what really struck me was that it was clear from the way that we were seeing the market evolve that there was going to be something here. And the pace of development that we had at the time, and this is all, I would say, like very firmly pre-product market fit, the pace of development was so high and was so fast, and our understanding of the market was evolving so quickly that I remember that providing a lot of optimism very, very quickly. To have that experience where it's like, that there's going to be a pot of gold, but you're going to have to really explore the whole forest to find it.
Bill, what did you see in Kevin that made you want him to be you obviously had a long relationship, but like what about him made you want to hire him, particularly because there are a few things more important than those first 10 people that join a company?
So Kevin's academic background, he didn't share this, is actually in neuroscience. And he decided to learn to code along the way because he wanted to actually make money, and had participated in a number of the coding challenges at MIT while getting his neuroscience degree. But I felt that given what we were working on and the way that we were thinking about, kind of the science of like human relationships and the way to kind of connect and have that resonance with people and relevance, that the combination of someone with, brain and cognitive sciences background, along with the ability to actually build and execute in the early days from a software engineering perspective, would be particularly valuable to us as we were growing. And that was one of the major reasons that, I really wanted to get Kevin on board.
Bill, when you decided to commit to work on this, did you think you were going to build a giant company, or did it just seem like, oh, this is interesting, there's a lot of what was your level of ambition and confidence that you would be eventually running a publicly traded company?
I often get the question as we reach these milestones, you open a new office, you ring the bell, you do an all hands for the first time post COVID, and there's like 1,000 people in the room, and people are like, did you picture it like this? Like, did you ever think we would be there? And I've always been like, well, I never thought we wouldn't. I didn't like explicitly think through the details of what scaling would mean, but I understand how exponential growth works, and I never assumed we wouldn't succeed and continue to grow and scale. And so there's definitely a little bit of, the blissful ignorance of all the downside risks and all the ways that you might fail, and just staying focused on the path that we're going to keep building and executing, and knowing that, if we do that as we continue to grow, if we've got the right vision and we keep effectively putting one foot in front of the other, that we're going to get there eventually. I never really put a lot of time in explicitly visualizing what those milestones would be or what they would feel like. But there wasn't necessarily doubt along the way. Maybe there should have been, but I think that's one of the magic things of being a founder, is that you just need to, in many cases, it's not even that you need to ignore it. It just never really comes knocking.
I want to go back to that first 3 to 9 months when you were getting the company off the ground full time. Did you spend time looking at what other companies were in the space? And did you spend a lot of time with customers, or was it more just ideating a little bit removed?
We didn't have, or we at least didn't perceive direct competitors necessarily. So there was no competition to look at. And in fact, I couldn't have even told you like what CRM stood for when we started the company, comically enough. We also, interestingly, didn't start out building for marketers, which is interesting, but it's just primarily because mobile apps didn't have marketing teams when we first started the company. If you don't have a business model, there's not a lot of reason to try to pour fuel on the fire of your business model. And, along the way, as mobile apps started to mature into businesses and they started to become more sophisticated, the space that we were building for ended up getting owned by marketing. And obviously now is helping define what the leading edge of marketing and customer engagement even is. At the time, we were really building for mobile app developers. The reason that I think developers alone were able to be effective in those early days was because the distribution mechanism of the App Store was just so incredible. And so we were definitely working with mobile app developers. We were going to, a lot of mobile app meetups. I had already been in the mobile industry a bit before. And so a lot of great opportunities in my network and community to be able to bounce ideas off of people and really figure out, along the way, what was going to be valuable to mobile app developers. We also did look at things like game mechanics. We were definitely watching the way that UI and UX paradigms were developing and evolving, because that was really important in the early days, especially because our vision for our product would involve being incorporated into the actual mobile apps. And so that meant that you couldn't just be an email or a push notification coming in over the top. You actually had to be part of the look and feel and the interaction of the app. And so we were very, I would say, immersed in the entire mobile app ecosystem at the time. But interestingly enough, as I alluded to at the beginning, the mobile app ecosystem itself wasn't really ready or open to us. I remember giving presentations at mobile app meetups in New York in 2011 and 2012. And the tagline was to turn your app into a business, and people were skeptical because a lot of app development at the time was just hobbyists that were kind of building things and throwing them into the App Store. And so we definitely had things that we could draw on, but we also really tangibly had to make a bet about the way that the app economy would grow up in a way that we couldn't tangibly see. And even when we went and talked to some of our potential early customers, I remember someone telling me that they didn't want our service because the sooner people stopped using their app, the sooner they could stop paying the server bill for those people. And they had already made all the money they were ever going to make on them because they bought their app for $1.99 and that was it. And so they didn't want an engagement platform. And so that was an interesting example where we had to look at that and be like, okay, that customer feedback is wrong. Our conviction was that the mobile app ecosystem would turn into, a thriving economy with great sustainable businesses, but they just weren't there yet to be able to even talk to.
Can you talk in a little bit more detail? You started to, but in that first year, how would you articulate the different versions of the product that you actually shipped? It sounded like the earliest product was less sort of what the product is today and more like user management and user profiles and engagement sort of all in one. Like, what were those first handful of turns and what did that actually look like?
We thought about it as like a toolkit for engagement. And, you picked up on something there, which is actually that it also included a user feedback module in it so that people could do customer support from within the AppBoy platform. And interestingly enough, a lot of our development in years 2 and 3 was about cutting early scope that we had built and then deepening the things that survived through that. And so, removing that user editable user profile, but at the same time, allowing that profile to be much more comprehensive and flexible behind the scenes. We actually removed the user feedback module entirely. First we experimented with stopping demoing it because it ended up being a distraction during sales cycles. And we felt that the space we were working in around specifically in fully automated engagement, as opposed to engagement from a one-on-one basis, was where we really wanted to go. And we started out with a lot of like hard-coded user journeys where you would get, badges and you would get specific messages like that would show up in your newsfeed based off of your usage patterns or accomplishments or achievements that you had in the application and such, and really started to make a lot of those more generic. And they were generic in the data models, but the way that we actually presented them to the people that were using our software was much more hard-coded. And so that was what a lot of the early development was we started with kind of an opinionated toolkit. And then we ended up whittling it down while also making the surviving parts substantially more flexible and customizable.
Yeah, I think during those months is also when a lot of the foundational elements of how we really differentiate the product today, a lot of those foundations were really laid then. So starting to have the realization that mobile was not sort of the second of two channels that were going to exist for marketing between email and mobile. But what mobile really was creating was an entirely different paradigm, an entirely different network of ways that you could reach somebody. And that was going to cause sort of this Cambrian explosion of other channels and other platforms you would have to expand to. And so a lot of the architecture decisions we were making then were, like Bill said, laying that foundation in a way that could be expanded. Another set of, I think, important decisions that were made, that's around when we started to really settle on this event streaming architecture that we still have today so that we can be a real-time and responsive platform. That was really critical because that's what we needed to do just to get even our most basic, say, like in-app channels to work in any sort of coherent way. But what we started to realize with this was that that's the way that the entire world was going to work in a few years. And so we baked that into the very direct assumptions of the overall platform. And so a lot of the work that was happening, if you were sort of looking at the product from the outside, looked like sort of tweaking and adding a few different ways of messaging here and there. But on the inside, it was really sort of retooling the engine because every week we were crystallizing more and more the way that we thought that the world was going to be. I think there's some interesting parallels, say, to where like AI is today, where I think that AI is probably a few quarters earlier than that, and people still don't know what's going to happen. And there's a lot more change going on, so it's probably a little bit harder to predict at this moment in time. But that's sort of the journey that we were on in those early days.
Yeah, we also had really interesting early kind of product development moments and customer feedback moments as we backed into some of these older industries. So like email marketing as an example. For us, it was non-negotiable to do everything interactively and in real time. And for us, real time didn't mean faster than a nightly batch. It meant literally you're using a mobile application, and if it freezes for more than 50 milliseconds, you think that it's died and you're going to force quit it, right? Like you had to be interactive in terms of the personalization and the delivery. And so we applied that to everything that we did. And then we would go and talk to marketers, and they'd be like, oh, and so when I define an audience like this, like how long do I have to wait before I can send to it? The question didn't even compute for us because everything that you did in our product was completely real time, like everything from an audience perspective. It was streaming. It was a real time classifier. It wasn't this batch process where you run a SQL query and you get a bunch of people out of it, you write them down, and then you send an email to that list. It was all really built to use real time classifiers and to live in that stream of data. And that was, second nature to us because it was just required by the interaction paradigm of mobile. It resulted in a whole bunch of capabilities that we had that we didn't even realize were differentiated against, that kind of more legacy space of just siloed, specifically email marketing products. But it also resulted in some places where there's things that are easy to do in SQL that are hard to do in real-time streaming. And so we had this funny juxtaposition of having this differentiated, extremely powerful capabilities, but we were also missing things that a lot of customers of existing categories would have considered table stakes. And, that resulted in some interesting prioritization Jenga that we had to do, where we needed to make sure that our go-to-market was targeted at the people that appreciated our differentiators enough that they were willing to ignore the things that we were missing that were table stakes. And we knew that we couldn't just kind of build all those table stakes things because we were literally almost 20 years, we were, I guess at the time, 12 years behind the email marketing clouds we were competing against. We weren't just going to be able to build all that stuff overnight. So we had to both be really choiceful about how we close the gaps on the expectations for the existing category, while also finding the right people out there in the market that, really appreciated us for our real-time capability. So as a result, most of our early customers were places where real time was non-negotiable. So, delivery applications, dating apps, like anything that was interacting with the real world. There was a lot in gaming and anything where in-product use cases were more important, say, than email use cases.
Maybe sort of on that point, what's the story behind your first handful of customers?
When we go back to the early days, we had a beta, and I think we had like over 1,000 people sign up for the beta. We announced it on TechCrunch, and all the normal places from back in the day. And it's a kind of a funny number to look at because we had 1,000 beta signups in like the first 2 weeks when we announced it. And even still today, we only have a little bit over 2,000 customers. And out of those 1,000 beta signups, I don't think we have any customers today that actually would have come out of that initial set. And so the earliest foray into customers, we weren't asking people to pay for it either. And so that was a chasm that needed to be, moved over. And at the time, as I mentioned, a lot of mobile app developers were hobbyists and, they weren't necessarily willing to spend money. And if they couldn't make money on their customers in the long term, there was no reason for them to pay someone to be able to engage them in the long term. And so that created some interesting early friction because, as I mentioned, the early customer hadn't really emerged yet in the market. And then what happened over time is growth teams started to grow up. And this is around like growth hacking and data-driven marketing tactics and being able to kind of evolve strategy quickly, compounding learnings through experimentation and being able to do that in a data-driven way. And that was actually something that was just a very natural use case for us because we had this agility built into everything being real time. We had this data-driven user profile to be able to determine the messaging. We were still pretty rudimentary from an analytics standpoint at the time. And that was something that needed to kind of be built and grow up. But what we found was that these early growth teams that were part of mobile apps were our ideal customer. And that was something that was still in the early days, but they were also a pretty tight-knit community because they were kind of forging a new, more data-driven, more experimental way of approaching a lot of marketing. And that wasn't something that was being taught in school. It was something that was being, learned as it was growing and as it was evolving. And so what we did in the early days really was we looked for those teams, those job titles, and we looked in the mobile apps that we felt were going to benefit from what we were doing. And so early subscription apps were important as well. It took a while before, for instance, cell data was cheap enough and fast enough that you could do music streaming. But, those were places where you were able to transplant an existing business model over to a new form factor. And, the music streaming applications already had a way to make money as an example. And so they were, great early customers, dating applications that were charging subscription fees and just really anyone that was getting that early user traction and actually had an incentive to keep their customers around for a while.
Yeah, the moment that I really remember was we had a holiday party at a beer garden. And I remember thinking like, wow, this is really working because we had just signed a number of our early true enterprise customers. And what was more important, I think, about these enterprise customers than just the fact that we had them was the fact that they were all using then Appboy, now Braze, in the same approximate way, which was the way that really aligned with our vision for where the world was going. I think of an enterprise customer as it's like a little bit like dating or like a little bit like dating to get married. And it's a red flag if you go on a date and all the person wants to talk about is like, wow, you got a great car. You've got a great apartment or something like that. It's like, that's not really why you want to go on a date with them. Whereas with these customers, they were very locked in on that overall vision that we had with that sort of, very early proto version of a growth team where you would talk to them and they would say, all right, I'm running a mobile app right now. And these are my ambitions and these are my KPIs. And this is something that we look for in a modern growth team right now. They tend to be very tied to core business metrics. And they would say, all right, I'm running mobile right now, but really, I ought to be running the web team too. I ought to be running the email team. All of this should be working together. All of this should be working in real time. We should be building like a much deeper relationship with our customers. And for us, it was like, yes, exactly. That's exactly what we think you should be doing as well. That was sort of the moment for me to realize like, okay, we've reached sort of like the root node of this overall web of different possibilities. This is where we need to be. These are the buyers. We've got 3 of them right now, but 10 more conversations next week. It's going to be 100 the week after that. And that was really the moment for me.
How far into the company's life was that?
It was a couple, 2 to 3 years, really. And Thankfully, venture capital is an industry that allows you to build things for a couple of years before you have revenue. We ran out of money once. We almost ran out of money twice. In each of our early fundraising rounds, I've mentioned several times that the market really wasn't ready for us to sell to it yet. Our answer to why now, the best one we probably had was so we can get a multi-year head start on something we are very convicted in, but not everyone agreed with that conviction. It wasn't until our Series D, 6 years into the business, that we ever had a fundraising round where we got more than one term sheet. It was tough in the early days. And, we had that conviction. And I remember someone telling me, the first customer is as hard as the next 10, and that's as hard as the next 100. And I remember thinking to myself, I fucking hope so, because that first one was so hard. And, the early days, it was sometimes difficult to really maintain that full conviction because of how long it took. But then, of course, one of the things that happened was that as the market started to come together, and by that I mean, mobile apps started to develop as businesses, smartphones obviously deployed very rapidly around the world, and those things kind of came hand in hand. That all started to come together for us in a really positive way. And the would-be competitors at the time, actually, many of them had distracted themselves, or they had kind of cut corners or taken shortcuts. And one of the examples of that actually is that mobile gaming was one of the first places to make any money in mobile. And so if you go back to 2012 to 2015, probably 85, 90% of the SaaS businesses that were in mobile were very focused on helping the gaming industry because it was the kind of quickest route to make money in the early days. But we had conviction, again, that this was going to fundamentally change the way that we lived our lives and change the economy. And so we stayed focused on building a product that would be, widely useful across all different verticals. And we didn't, focus ourselves specifically in on gaming. We also felt that gaming at the time, a lot of it was about either kind of milking whales or tricking children into, buying a lot of in-app purchases on their parents' phones. And that was like not a business model that we felt was sustainable either, and didn't want to really run after that. And so as a result, when the market did come together, we were there and we had already built this diversified capability. And everyone else actually had to spend time pivoting away from gaming. And some of them never managed to actually complete the pivot. Others tried to turn into a more of a horizontal offering for mobile games, as opposed to being a more vertically, focused offering around customer engagement, which we, were very focused on the vertically integrated stack and on building comprehensive capability around, all these product areas we've talked about. And when you look at Braze today, actually, our largest single vertical is only around 21, 22% of our revenue. And we have a highly diversified customer base across a whole bunch of different places. And gaming is one of those. It lives in it's about a teens% of our revenue. And we, of course, eventually did come back to compete in that. But it was a little bit of a Nash equilibrium play where we're like, everyone else is going after gaming. This other prize is over here. It's not as big as gaming is right now, but we think it's going to eventually be substantially larger. And so we're going to just keep investing for that future that we think is going to come.
Yeah, we kind of violated one of the rules, I think, around like that, like a traditional lean startup methodology of build a super narrow product for one use case, be 10x better, and then grow from there, because we had that really strong opinion on where the market and the technology were ultimately going to go. With that opinion, it's like you look at this world of, cross-channel, real-time, very robust engagement, and you realize, okay, no, we can't just build this one narrow thing. That market requires 50 things. It requires a whole lot of functionality. And in a way, the fact that it took some time for the market to really turn towards what we were building for, obviously it's scary. You don't want to run out of money. But it did give us a lot of time, such that we had built probably 35 of those 50 things by the time it turned over. And we were then able to grow very, very quickly with a lot of differentiation, which was really helpful.
You mentioned this a few minutes ago, but when you originally did your TechCrunch announcement of the beta and you had 1,000 people on the waiting list, did you go email them and said, hey, we're excited for you to try the product, and then they came in and just churned and never activated? What happened with those early customers that weren't obviously the right fit, or the product wasn't quite there at the time?
A lot of them did integrate, and that was great because it was good technical vetting. A lot of them continued using our product for quite a while afterward. But, a lot of those early apps just didn't make it.
Yeah, they weren't businesses. They were just sort of hobbyists.
Yeah. And some of them did, eventually turn into businesses, but there was a bit of a step function that happened where we had those early customers and it was a different lens on the product, same product space, but we weren't charging for it. And actually the biggest pivot that we made in the early days was really around the business model and the way that we ended up charging customers, because in the early days there was an idea that we could potentially build a B2B2C kind of network to be able to do app install ads or other sorts of kind of advertising injection into the newsfeed. And that would allow for us to kind of finance this toolkit that we then provide to app developers. But as we were going, a lot of the feedback that we were getting is like people wanted to kind of break it apart. They didn't necessarily want anything branded by us in the application, et cetera. And, we were kind of looking at it as like, okay, we can get more early customers where they want the newsfeed here and they want to be able to use the slide up. They're not going to use this or that or whatever. And our early business model idea would have required that everything stayed intact. It stayed together as a bundle so that we would be able to run the advertising in the feed. What we eventually decided to do was like, okay, there's a willingness for people to pay for these capabilities. They just don't want it the way that we bundled it and that we're trying to deliver it to them. And so why don't we remove those constraints and just start charging them for it directly as SaaS contracts? And so as we went through that then required us approaching a new type of customer in a new way with a new commercial model. And the product didn't need to change a ton, but it was basically adding flexibility to the product in order to give people what they wanted from it or what parts of it they wanted from it. And I think along the way, it's possible some of those early 1,000 signups did eventually become customers. There was kind of an abrupt change when we shifted from trying to monetize in a network-based way and shifting over to actually doing annual contracts. And that then resulted in kind of a bifurcation of where we were trying to go to market and who was there. But those early beta users were really helpful in a lot of the technical vetting, a lot of the early customer feedback, and also ultimately in crystallizing that we needed to change the approach that we were taking from a business model perspective.
What's the story behind those first few enterprise customers using the product in the way that you wanted in this repeatable fashion?
So the first enterprise customers, and we had a distinction in the early days between the mobile titans, which were the mobile apps that were growing and scaling quickly. And then there was like the enterprise, who were companies that already existed that were then trying to build a mobile presence. We were trying to build for both. We weren't trying to sell to banks in the early days, right? So it wasn't like enterprise with like really heavyweight compliance and security and things like that. It was more like online retailers. And our wedge that we found there was that they already had a business model. They already knew that, if they could engage customers better, they would make more money. And they had data-driven marketing teams. And, I've commented a lot over the years that one of the really cool things about, Braze and our evolution and with the market is that we sell to a bunch of job titles that didn't exist when we started the company. And, that's been true for a long time. But that also meant that as this mobile space was emerging, there was also a new way of doing marketing that was emerging at the same time. And so, those early customers on the enterprise side, they were primarily like online retailers. They were places where, they had someone that was ambitious. They were leaning into, mobile as a place that people would do commerce in the future. And they knew that if they could engage customers, more real time with higher relevance, they were going to drive more purchases. And then on the other side were the mobile titans. And these were primarily subscription or freemium mobile app services, where for them, getting people through that early subscription funnel, really taking a lot of money was being spent on mobile acquisition at the time in order to drive installs. But this was still the early days and people thinking about things like daily active users, monthly active users, stickiness, looking at different cohorts and how they were onboarding and what your retention curve looked like. This is the very early days for a lot of that data analysis. In fact, one of the easiest qualification questions in the early days of the sales cycle was asking a customer how many monthly active users they had. Shockingly, a lot of them didn't know, right? They knew their downloads and their installs and they knew where they were in the App Store charts, but no one was paying attention to what was happening after, day zero of the install. And so it was really like, who were those people out there in the market that understood how important the shape of their retention curve was to their overall economics of their business. And we're going to go after it in a data-driven way, in an experimental way, and really like understood how that impacted their bottom line. And we had to go find those people.
When you think about those first few years, would you describe it as more of a random walk of just trying different things, being convicted that there was a broad secular trend here that mattered? Or was there a level of precision by which you were going about this work?
There was a precision to it. And maybe actually, if I was going to fault us in one direction, it would be that we were a little too opinionated and precise. And then the feedback was like kind of
I'd agree with that.
Sharpening us, right? Kind of shaving things off and focusing them in. To Kevin's point before, we didn't pick a really narrow slice and we're focusing on that. We actually, because we had this broader conviction, we were building a little bit more comprehensively than probably we should have. And what the customer feedback did wasn't necessarily gave us new ideas about new places to build, but it told us where to focus and where to, shift. And the first few years probably involved just as much, or not like literally the first few years, but in those kind of years 3 through 5, it involved just as much like orphaning of ideas that we had early on that we decided weren't going to have legs in the long run as it did, really building and growing things that we knew that we had to focus on.
I would say like fishing in this one pond that we had a lot of conviction was maybe not a pond, it was maybe like a huge ocean. And so if anything, it was like, all right, we're just going to fish every single spot in this pond, and we're going to use a rod, we're going to use a net, we're going to try anything we can. Like there was a lot of busy activity. We were at a very, very high pace, I think, despite the lack of, at that point, paying customers that were actively pulling us in any direction. But what I would say is that it was all very, very focused around that core idea and around the market that we were increasingly sure was going to emerge.
Was it a step function change that sort of got you oriented correctly? Or in those 6 months before that holiday party, when you started to see happy customers in the enterprise that were willing to pay, it was like this gradual, slow turning of the crank, if you will?
I think it was more gradual because it also required evolution happening around us. It wasn't just us building and growing into a market that already existed or a demand function that already existed. It was us growing up with the mobile app economy. And it was us also growing up with these new ways of organizing marketing teams and operating them. I mentioned the new job titles, but it was kind of really interesting being at the convergence of an entirely new craft, a new set of skills, a new way of running a marketing team, a new way, and one that was also more interdisciplinary because, there was this opportunity to interact in the product. Even here in 2024, people talk about the customer 360 and they talk about sales and support and ignore the product experiences, that are so important for us to be able to maintain connection to a brand and be able to drive that long-term loyalty and engagement and all these revenue generation opportunities. But the entrance of that kind of first-party interface through a mobile application meant that a lot of these goals that you might have had before around CRM or marketing or what have you were now starting to permeate other places as well. It wasn't just shooting an email in your inbox, taking your billboard, trying to get it in someone's inbox and trying to get them to your website. It was really integrating into the entire customer lifecycle. And so that just meant that a lot was changing at the same time and a lot was maturing and growing. And we needed those things to come together. And it's actually one of the reasons why, when we raised money in the early days, it was hard to do. But we also didn't really have a goal of going out and raising a tremendous amount of money in our early rounds because we didn't feel like the market was actually mature enough for us to go and rapidly scale a GTM or ramp up the expectations on our early scaling and growth. We actually had a number of competitors in the early days who went out, at the same time we went and raised $10 to $15 million Series A, they went and raised a $50 million Series A, and they actually burned themselves out. Despite having more resources, they were effectively trying to push on a rope. And we had that visibility into our market, and we also had the patience to understand that there were some exogenous factors that certainly we could influence. We could be out there at a meetup, trying to encourage people to think about their app in a certain way or run their marketing team in a certain way. We can train our customers on how to use our software and how to be more data-driven, experimental, et cetera. We were only a few dozen people, depending on kind of what period in time this is, in a market that, was much, much larger than us. And so I think just being cognizant of the evolution of those exogenous factors, along with the product development that we were doing, and how those things pace together. And then thinking about what that meant for our scaling strategy as well was really, really important for us to navigate and survive through those early years.
But what I think was also interesting about our buyer and is worth thinking about for any startup out there in terms of the buyer they're focusing on is that these marketing buyers there are a lot of network effects in marketing, because if I'm running much better marketing than you are, and we have a very similar sort of brand, I'm going to win, and I'm going to win really big. I'm going to win sort of like a power loss sort of way over you, whatever brand has much worse branding or much worse marketing. And so as a result, there's some very powerful sort of like competitive natural selection in the marketing and growth world. So as a result, once the first sort of crop of brands out there started to use products like Braze and start to really find success with them, very, very rapidly, there was intense competition in the market, and the market started to pivot en masse really, really quickly. I think there's also this aspect where a lot of these marketers, especially in those times, early 2010s, they remembered the dawn of the internet, and they remembered that this was such a massive sea change that it was really scary in their industry. And so, if anything, they were kind of like a little bit overly jumpy to hop onto what the next new paradigm was. And especially once it was working, they really flooded in. And that really helped us in the early days because I think, again, since we had built a much sort of thicker rather than thinner product in the early days, we were really ready to kind of welcome them with open arms once that network effect really kicked off within that industry.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that it wasn't uncommon that we would ask people how many monthly active users they had, and they didn't know. But then, Facebook goes public, and they obviously had arguably one of the most engaging products ever built. And they talked about their daily active users and their monthly active users on a regular basis. It was in every earnings call. And so that was actually, an interesting example where that was an exogenous factor, but it kind of happened all at once, because once that started to be part of how people described success, in a mobile app as an online business, that very quickly permeated the rest of the customer space. And, people started to understand like, oh, I need to know what this is. I need to be able to optimize this. Concepts like stickiness or your 7-day or 30-day retention, those were new ideas, but they're correct ideas, to Kevin's point, like they caught fire. And I think once some of those new ideas about how to be more efficient with your acquisition spend, how to think about retention cohorts, once those started to permeate those communities of marketers, that really created ingredients for us to scale more rapidly.
So when you think back to your first few million in revenue, what was the product, what was the positioning, and what was the customer base at that time?
The product in broad strokes, very similar to what you see today. It's obviously much more sophisticated and comprehensive now, but it was, data and event-driven messaging across different channels in order to keep track of where the user was in their user journey and what they were interested in, and then be able to leverage that understanding to deliver messaging to them that was usually either going to help early retention, help convert them into a premium subscriber, or help drive incremental revenue through purchases. Those were the major money generating use cases. There was also a lot of transactional use cases, just a lot of operational messaging along the way to be able to communicate with people. We also had a lot of delivery applications where, for instance, we would tell you that your order was on the way or that the driver was outside, like those kinds of things. And so we were broadly doing all forms of messaging. But a lot of times when you're underwriting the business case and what drove the revenue, it was about kind of those three things. It was like, hey, you're spending a huge amount of money on user acquisition. We're going to improve your retention curve. And man, if we can even move that 50 basis points, on day 7 or day 30, that's a 10x ROI because of how much money you're spending on acquisition. Similarly, same concept is just optimizing your premium subscriber flow and then driving the incremental revenue. And so our early customer base was a mix of those online retailers trying to drive incremental purchases, and then early mobile, primarily subscription businesses, or just ones that had a premium upsell through in-app purchases of some kind if it wasn't a subscription, and trying to drive people through that purchase funnel through additional retention. It was surprisingly global, even at 3 million. And actually today we do 45% of our revenue outside the United States, but that number has been in the high 30s, early 40s since well before IPO. I used to get questions about that when we would raise financing rounds, be like, why is your business so global? And I would also look at it and be like, it was kind of annoying on the one hand, because we didn't have people in those places. So we had to spend a lot of time getting on planes to go visit, early customers, because our first 10 very large customers, like one of them was in Berlin, one was in Norway, one was in Armenia, we had one in Singapore, and then there were another half a dozen that were in the US. I think only one of them was in New York. And so we only had one that was in our own backyard. The rest of them we had to get on planes, some of them we had to cross oceans. But I think that was really a testament to how global of an opportunity it was and how great of a distribution mechanism the App Store was, because you didn't need to be in the US to take advantage of, the wealth of the US market as a new mobile app. You could launch from anywhere in the world, and you were in the App Store and you could process in-app purchases in every currency. And that was just an incredible distribution mechanism and opportunity for those early businesses. And that resulted in us being very global right out of the gate. They had those two qualities. Either they were already selling something to someone, or they were one of these mobile titans, often in subscription, but they were spread out across a bunch of different verticals as well. And that really helped drive a lot of the demand signal for things being flexible and customizable. And, performance was obviously an imperative all the way through because of what we were doing with real-time, on-demand services, car share delivery, like local dating apps, things like that.
When you think about the first handful of customers, did you get them through some inbound? They heard about you, they were at a conference, or were you outbounding and sort of trying to develop, what would be considered account-based marketing or something now, where you found, the head of growth at company X, you hustled to get a meeting with them, sort of that type of thing?
Yeah, it was much more outbound. We would occasionally pick up a good warm lead by presenting at a meetup or being at a conference or something like that. But we didn't have any meaningful budgets to be able to spend on kind of broader demand gen. The early customers, there was a lot of qualification required and a lot of active selling. We had to kind of paint the vision for people in many cases. And so a lot of it was a direct motion. And, a lot of us were involved in it. That adage that, everyone needs to be a seller was absolutely true in our early days.
Did you find, as you started to get into stronger product market fit, the next marginal customer became easier to get? And there's sort of this classic metaphor of it was like you were pushing a rock up a hill and eventually it started to go down a hill.
It ebbed and it flowed because I think there were times when we'd get a great, we would launch something new that, really resonated with people. We had a lead on the competition in the early days. And so there was kind of this moment where as the market came together and before competitors woke up to it or had time to kind of pivot over to the opportunity, we had some free sailing there for a little while. But as I mentioned, we also had a hard time raising in the early days. And, we had other people that were kind of come in from deeper pocketed adjacencies and things like that. And so there were moments where then the noise, and we were in New York, we weren't in Silicon Valley, we weren't a YC company, we didn't have, big brand name backers and things like that. And we had competitors that did. I'm obviously biased, but I feel like we had the better product the whole time. We would go through these kind of ebbs and flows where we would have some clear sailing and then there would be a lot of noise in the market and our lack of kind of brand presence and awareness would really harm us. There would be new opportunities coming up and we just weren't getting a seat at the table for those opportunities. We would evolve our go-to-market. We would start to get, those seats at the table. We would break into those networks. People within that marketer community would start to know more about us. And so we'd get those at-bats and we could win those at-bats when we would get them, especially when we would build something new in the platform that took a long time for our competitors to be able to imitate or be able to answer. And so, I think it was both at the same time. Like we would have these downhill portions that felt really good and things were coming together. And then we'd have, a bunch of competitive noise would happen for some reason, or we would, in order to hit our next set of goals, we needed to be able to double or triple or, 10x the amount of lead flow. And we just didn't have the demand gen budgets to be able to do that, or we didn't have the sales team coverage to be able to do that. And we'd need to work out, a new way of being able to go to market more efficiently and a lot of learning along the way. So yeah, if you're in this journey, I think sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, and that's probably pretty natural.
Yeah, I think there's also this element where product market fit isn't static because you end up in this situation where you have really tight product market fit, say for those early mobile titans, but we didn't necessarily, like Bill referenced earlier, have really tight product market fit for a bank. And so it starts to feel really, really slow in some places. And if anything, you're pushing an even bigger rock up an even steeper hill when you're, say, entering a new market adjacency, you're entering a new sort of customer persona that's maybe structurally or for whatever reason not really as ready a buyer as your core market. And so you do end up with a lot of places where there's really high growth in sort of one sector of the business that you've been selling to really successfully. But then I know one large transition for us was that we had a lot of strength in the early days out of mobile. Email, of course, we now know is a mobile channel, but a lot of marketers did not necessarily realize that in sort of the early days of mobile, that it was all going to be so tightly intertwined. And so as we were making a really big push into email, that felt like something where we were certainly pushing the rock uphill for a certain period of time, just because we were really entering a different, very, very large market. And so I think it's a natural evolution, but what's really key is just to not view product market fit as sort of a stamp that you get in your passport and then you're off to the races. It's something that you are continually consolidating and also continually looking to expand if you want to have the TAM to build a really large business.
If you strive right now to be as intellectually honest as possible, when you think back to the first few years of getting into product market fit in the way that you've articulated it, what things would you bucket in you were just lucky? And in what areas would you say the most skill was at play?
one of the most important pieces of luck was that through a combination of being very persuasive, Bill didn't mention this about his background, but he's like a national champion debater, or having a really strong team or having a really strong prototype, that we were able to survive to the point that the market turned in the direction that we were aimed at. It was probably more skill than luck that we had sort of picked the right direction to go in. I mean, we were all in the early team very early adopters of mobile and really in sync with where we thought that market was going. But I will also say to your question, there's one element which is different, which is that you really need to just put in the hours and just do a lot of stuff to get product market fit. Otherwise, or you can, I guess, get incredibly lucky. But generally speaking, for I think almost any software business, you just need to take so many shots on goal just to really consolidate that strong product market fit to get kind of explosive traction. And that element is something that I think is pretty universal across all startups, but is really important for anyone listening to consider, is that you should expect to have to put in a lot of effort just to have enough shots on goal that you capture product market fit.
Yeah, and I think I would agree that the biggest luck component was probably just the timing, that we didn't, in fact, fully run out of money, that we didn't stall out, and that the market did come into its own in time for us to take full advantage of that. Choosing mobile because of our tremendous conviction and just how big of an opportunity it would be. I do think that to some extent also surprised on the upside. You look back on even just the most recent past of the last few years and just how thoroughly mobile has really permeated every aspect of our lived life. That, I think, created an opportunity that was just tremendously large. And, we were born from a conviction behind that. But I think even looking at it now, it's like the fact that mobile has permeated every corner of the globe and spread more than any technology that's ever come before it, including even like literacy, to be able to read your phone. There's a phone in almost every human being's hand. The average number of them is greater than one per human on this planet. And, the spread of mobile cell networks goes further than, even terrestrial electricity and the ability to charge them from a grid. These devices have so thoroughly permeated every part of our life, and that's created huge economic opportunity. The timing and the scale of that, we couldn't have planned that specifically. And we embarked on a journey without a real answer to that question of why now specifically. We had a why now generally, but I think we got lucky that we survived not having why now specifically answered pretty well.
What are the most important things that you figured out that if a friend of yours who's really talented is going to start a company, you try to impart on them?
I think the first one is just about commitment and endurance and making sure that the thing that you want to go and build is something that you want to dedicate at least a decade to. I think a lot of people, they kind of perceive startups as these like great opportunities for to be disruptive and build, wealth and what have you, but they also succumb to a lot of the headlines of this or that acquisition happened and it happened, quickly and in the early years of it or whatever. And there's a lot of people that I talk to who, you just ask them, how long do you think it takes on average for a company to IPO? They grossly underestimate things like that. And so just making sure that there's commitment and conviction and that it's something that they want to dedicate, every waking hour to for many years from here on out. And therefore that requires passion in the space. It requires conviction. The other big thing that I try to challenge people on is the path of fundraising, because everyone also just defaults to let's go out and raise as much money as we can right away, and don't really grapple with the fact that there's a lot of businesses that people may start that are not appropriate to be venture backed, and when they go and they try to kind of back them with other investors, they very quickly lose control of exactly what trajectory it needs to be on, and how they're going to build it and things like that in a way that ends up being detrimental to their passion and to their connection to it. And so if those things are not aligned well, if it's like, hey, if you're going to go raise venture capital, your only option is to go keep scaling this to the moon. That's what you need to earnestly work on for a long time from now. And if that doesn't resonate with you, you need to rethink aspects of that. On the other hand, if that does, fantastic, and then I can, then we have a longer conversation about where and how you pace that and, how you go about it and a lot of details there. But those two starting conversations of just dedication, conviction, your endurance to do it over the long term, and the way that you want to go about it and how you're going to fund it and how you're going to grow it.
I've got a slightly more tactical one, which is it's well known sort of out there in the industry that you need to have technical ability. And, YC very famously talks about how they like technical founders and things like that. That's not a big secret, but I would take a much more pointed approach to it, which would be to assume that the life and death of your company will at some point and potentially at multiple points in the company's life hinge on your ability to win a product velocity foot race against every competitor in your market. Because in this sort of house-to-house fighting of what SaaS inevitably becomes. Because I think that a lot of folks think like, okay, I'll be able to get a product built and then, I'm going to put marketing behind it. I'm going to put sales behind it. We're going to raise a bunch of money, like 100,000 Twitter followers. It's going to be awesome. This whole thing's going to work. All of that helps. All of that can be a great accelerant. But ultimately to have, let's call it like terminal value product market fit, like the ability to actually kind of win an entire category, that requires just getting into these product foot races for a very long period of time and then winning them. And if you don't have that DNA, and I think we were fortunate enough, Bill and John, very technical, brilliant engineers. So we were fortunate enough to have that DNA. If you don't have that DNA and you don't really invest in and cultivate it, then you're not going to win that foot race, and somebody else is going to be able to marshal all of their go-to-market resources against you in the long run.
What things did you figure out that are more sort of insights that might be useful to folks as it relates to competition specifically?
It's important to think about pre and post-product market fit. I think pre-product market fit, competition, it's sort of more of an abstract sense because you don't even really know who you're going to be competing against or what you're going to be competing over. And even I would say up through maybe 2 million to 5 million ARR, I think that thinking too much about competition is generally distracting for two reasons. One is that you don't really know the identity of your company. And also you are not seeing enough of the deals in the market. You're not seeing enough of what's actually going on in the ecosystem that you actually have any leverage to do anything with competitive knowledge. So I think it's important to be competitor aware, but not really to act on it. But in the longer run, I actually disagree with the advice that you should just, completely ignore the competition. I mean, think about it. If you were in a boxing match, you would go and you would prepare for the match and you would work out and you would train on your own, but you're also probably going to look at tape of your competitor and just try to figure out, just generally what's going on. It's certainly a minority of the activities that a company should be doing, but I think it is part of the overall constellation of understanding what the environment is that you're operating in. For that matter, I think it's important to also understand your supply chain. What are the large cloud providers that you're reliant on going to do? Are they competitors in the long run? Are they partners? Are they allies in the long run? Just being very, situationally aware, I think is very, very important.
Efficiency in this matters a lot because you have to dedicate the vast majority of your resources to building your own vision. But also, if you're losing deals at the finish line and your sales team has spent, 6 months or longer and many, many hours trying to get you the opportunity to sell to a customer and you lose it, somewhere close to the finish line, that is a wildly inefficient use of the company's resources as well. And so I think if you're going to kind of pragmatically try to figure out how to balance out staying focused on the customer and running your own race versus knowing when to look at the competition, I would say look at those late stage losses and figure out, what led to those losses. Some of them, it makes sense and you should have lost those deals. And that's really good feedback to go back to qualification and say, hey, we need to get our sales team's time focused and prioritized. And so, if there were these criteria that led to us losing at the finish line, let's make sure that we qualify out of those deals, as long in the early days, you don't need to sell to that many customers. Your market penetration is going to be very, very low. And so you're better off trying to find the right customers in that ocean of opportunity than you are needing to win every single opportunity. And that obviously starts to shift over time as your scale gets bigger and your opportunity gets larger. And then the other side, and we talked about this a lot, is finding points of leverage where you have an unfair advantage against competitors and almost like a product, jujitsu, if you will. And so when you're analyzing those losses and you're like, hey, we've got this product gap, looking at that and saying all right, what's the bare minimum that we need to do? Or what's some way that we could take advantage of the way that we're architected versus our competitors to build something that's either going to be hard to imitate or where we can build it with a lot less effort than it took them to build it in the first place, or where they maybe overbuilt something and we lost because we were missing part of this thing, but not the whole thing, right? Those are all examples where you would look at it and be like, all right, this was an inefficient use of go-to-market resources. We think we should have won this customer. This reason that we lost it was on our roadmap. It just wasn't on our roadmap until next year, And that I think changing your product vision to adapt to competitors is absolutely an error to make. But changing the prioritization And then also finding opportunities for differentiation where you've got, some form of unfair leverage because you're relying on your architecture or some other thing that's unique about your company. Those are both responses to competition that I think are extraordinarily valuable to build for. And you should be able to do those without taking your eye off, the bigger ball of your customer feedback and everything else.
There's just a very strong management, leadership, emotional side to this as well, because I think that competition, if you obsess over it and if you talk about it all the time, and if you talk about it in a fatalistic way or even too emotionally agitated a way, it has an element where it will start to trigger something in large teams where they will start to obsess over it. And they will think about competition all the time. And they will start to ignore things that are much, much more important, like just operating and doing your job and just executing really, really well. And so I also think that it's really important as a leader of a company or somebody who's in a position where people are kind of listening to your opinion on competition to just be very, very measured about how one is operationally talking about and thinking through and reacting to competition. Because if you're not, this is just one of those areas of startup management that has the ability to get completely, out the barn door and take on a life of its own.
I like, Bill, what you said earlier when you were talking about I think it was you that mentioned sort of one of your architectural insights was this idea of real-time streaming. And so maybe it made sense to sort of find customers that cared about real-time streaming instead of trying to sell customers that don't care about it. And they're asking you about features that an incumbent has. And I think that idea of changing your customer is often the most valuable thing that you can do, where I think the intuition is just to change your product, basically, or value prop.
And I think also, there's two sides to early scale. On the one hand, if you're successful, the size of your customer base, at time of IPO or, 5-10 years from now is going to be 100 or 1,000 times higher than it is when you're in the early stages of product market fit. And so that's a really good reason to actually, well, it is important to listen to customers. You can't lose sight of your vision for how you're going to sell and conquer a much larger market and make sure you're building for that, because some of those early customers could be just as distracting as some of those early competitors, right? If you don't keep your eyes on that much higher scale opportunity that you're building toward. On the flip side, in the early days, you also, in the private markets, you only need one person with a big checkbook to believe in you, to make it to the next stage. In the early days of product market fit, in order to hit those early, scaling milestones, you only need, 1, 10, 100, a few hundred customers. And that means that, if there's hundreds of thousands of businesses out there that you could potentially sell to, you can be pretty choosy about the ones that you talk to if you only need 100 to hit next year's sales goal, right? So keeping in mind like what scale does and does not do for you and allowing that to, help you prioritize, I think is super critical in the early days.
So just a final question to wrap up. I would love each of you to sort of share what's the thing that the other has taught you that's kind of had the most residual value or kind of the thing that rattles around your brain the most?
The ability to be very strategically patient. I mean, something that I've always really respected about Bill, and I would say have come to respect and appreciate even more as Braze has been a public company and has been on this very, very long journey, is the fact that I think Bill is very good at thinking about what the company is going to need to do, positioned in a very general sense, like positioned in the marketplace, but also in terms of like company culture, in terms of, certain elements of team structure, things like that, to win big prizes over a very long time frames in a very definitive way. And I think that thinking in that way rather than just reacting, because at a startup, there's so many things that happen. There's 100 decisions a day, 30 new things come up. Half of them are really scary, like every single day for years and years and years. It's very easy to become very reactive. I think Bill is good at not being reactive when you should be reactive, but also has the ability to be reactive. And so that's probably one of the biggest things I'd say I've learned.
Yeah, the first thing that jumped to mind for me is I really hate repeating myself. It's one of when people ask me like, what's it like being a public company? And it's like, well, when I have to start at the beginning over and over and over again in every single investor meeting, I really just want to claw my eyes out. But I think Kevin actually taught me the value of repeating myself. Kevin was our first full-time product person. Like we were broadly just like a group of engineers designing and building the product, just kind of one amorphous engineering blob in the early days. And we first started to formalize product management, and that required communicating like the product strategy and the product vision to people. I had this allergy to repeating myself, and Kevin, really beat it into me that you just need to get up at every all hands and at every, company meeting and repeat the product vision and make sure that, people understand it. They understand its consequences, its second order effects. They can distill it down. They can repeat it. And that's going to require you to repeat yourself. And there's tremendous value in that. And so he didn't just teach it to me. He had to beat it into me for me to really embrace that. But I think it's incredibly valuable to make sure that everyone is really aligned and deeply understands the vision and where the company's going.
Awesome. Well, great place to end. Thank you guys for such a great conversation and sharing so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us on today.
Thanks, Brett.